Picture this, it's the winter of 1973. You've got cars lined up for blocks, incredibly frustrated drivers, and absolutely empty gas pumps. This was a brutal wake-up call. You see, for decades after World War II, America basically ran on this feeling of boundless optimism and, frankly, boundless cheap energy. But when the OPEC oil embargo hit, wow, that entire era crashed into a brick wall. Suddenly, the nation was forced to realize that resources and that legendary post-war economic boom actually had hard, unforgiving limits. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and deeply turbulent chapter in American history. We call it The Search for Order in an Era of Limits, and we're zeroing in on the years from 1973 to 1980. We're going to see how a rapid-fire succession of overlapping crises, we're talking economic, political, and cultural, basically forced Americans into a profound search for stability. And the craziest part? It's a search that permanently reshaped the nation's political map and cultural landscape in ways that, well, we still feel very clearly today. To make sense of this incredibly dense decade, we'll break down the chaos into 5 clear chapters: the era of limits, a crisis of authority, rethinking rights and roles, the family on trial, and finally, the conservative resurgence. Let's get started. Jumping right into part 1, the era of limits. The 1970s delivered severe economic shocks that brought the booming, post-war American economy to a grinding, very painful halt. Now, before the 70s, economists actually thought a condition known as stagflation was practically impossible. I mean, it literally contradicts basic economic principles. It's this painful combination of high unemployment, stagnant consumer demand, and runaway inflation all happening at the exact same time. It's kind of like stepping on the gas and the brakes of your car simultaneously, and somehow the entire engine just catches on fire. Prices were skyrocketing, but jobs were disappearing, and economic growth just completely stalled out. It completely baffled the experts and crippled the purchasing power of everyday Americans. To put that into perspective, just look at this striking statistic: 18%. That is how much discretionary income per worker plummeted between 1973 and 1982. Imagine losing nearly a fifth of your spending power. Actually, it was even worse, because the cost of basic necessities like milk and bread shot up by 20% in a single year, which is exactly what happened in 1974. It was just completely unsustainable. And the visceral reality of this economic shift was devastating. Massive steel mills, like the ones in Pittsburgh that ended up being demolished in the early 80s, represented the literal dismantling of America's industrial core. Foreign competition, especially from nations that had newly rebuilt highly modern facilities like West Germany and Japan, simply overwhelmed American manufacturing. It left behind boarded-up factories and displaced workers in a region that very quickly earned a new nickname: the Rust Belt. So, what does this mean politically? Well, this economic shift had a direct, massive impact on power. Between 1940 and 1990, the story is incredibly clear. Power physically moved. Rust Belt states like New York and Pennsylvania lost massive amounts of political clout. Meanwhile, Sun Belt states like California and Texas were booming, gaining dozens of congressional seats. This wasn't just some geographic quirk, it was a political earthquake. It moved influence right out of the union-heavy industrial North and down into the more conservative-leaning South and West. And that brings us to Chapter 2, a crisis of authority. Because as if those economic anxieties weren't enough, they were compounded by a spectacular collapse of trust in the federal government itself. You really can't talk about the 70s without talking about Watergate. This scandal escalated with dizzying speed. It starts in June 1972 with a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters, something the White House initially tried to brush off as a mere third-rate burglary. Yeah, right. Because by early 1973, those burglars are talking to investigators. By May, the Senate is holding televised hearings, exposing a sprawling web of wiretaps, hush money, and presidential cover-ups. And finally, by August 1974, Richard Nixon does something completely unprecedented in American history. He resigns the presidency. The fallout from that was immediate. Public disillusionment was so high that it swept 75 new, reform-minded Democrats into Congress in 1974. The press dubbed them the Watergate babies. They came in ready to clean up Washington, decentralize power, and make the government more transparent. But Here is the fascinating, slightly absurd irony of history. By dismantling the old, rigid committee structures and creating tons of new subcommittees, they actually made the government less efficient and far more susceptible to special interest lobbyists. Instead of having to deal with a few powerful committee chairs, lobbyists could now exert influence all over a much more diffuse system. In their total zeal to fix the system, the reformers accidentally rolled out the red carpet for the very special interests they wanted to fight. All right, part 3, rethinking rights and roles. With trust in institutions completely cratering, the nation really turned its focus inward, igniting fierce legal and cultural debates over equality. One of the absolute most intense debates of the era was over affirmative action. On one side, advocates strongly argued that equal opportunity required actively rectifying past imbalances for historically marginalized groups, often using specific hiring and university enrollment goals. On the other side, critics pushed back hard against what they termed reverse discrimination and strict quota systems. It's a huge societal divide that ultimately culminated in the highly complex 1978 Bakke decision, where the Supreme Court struck down a strict medical school quota system, but still allowed race to be considered as one factor among many in university admissions. Another massive cultural battleground was the Equal Rights Amendment. Two very distinct sides took their cases straight to the American public. The women's movement argued the ERA was an immediate, vital constitutional remedy to sex discrimination in federal and state laws. But countering this was conservative activist Phyllis Schlafly and her highly organized Stop ERA campaign. Schlafly argued that the amendment would actually strip women of existing legal protections, maybe even force them into the military draft, and ultimately threaten traditional family structures. Her grassroots campaign was incredibly effective, mobilizing thousands of people and successfully stalling the ERA just shy of the state ratifications it needed to pass. Which brings us to Chapter 4, the family on trial. Because this combination of economic stagnation and rapidly shifting social mores placed immense, undeniable strain on the traditional nuclear family. The traditional American household was basically under a microscope, facing compounding pressures from every possible angle. Divorce rates literally doubled between 1965 and 1985. We also saw the rapid rise of the two-income family, and often this wasn't just a choice for personal independence. It was an absolute necessity just to combat that brutal stagflation we talked about earlier. Millions of women entered the workforce just to keep their families afloat. And at the exact same time, the sexual revolution was fundamentally redefining relationships and how people viewed personal happiness. You really feel the friction of the era when you compare the different realities happening at the exact same time. You had women like Donna Wright in 1979, breaking barriers as the only woman working at the Blue Ribbon Mine, stepping directly into a traditionally male blue-collar role. But simultaneously, you had the rise of a massive, highly organized evangelical pushback seeking a return to scriptural family structures. This movement was led by figures like televangelist Pat Robertson, who was broadcasting a traditionalist message right into millions of American living rooms. And that friction leads us seamlessly into our fifth and final chapter, the conservative resurgence. We're going to look at how all of this profound cultural and economic anxiety ultimately fueled the rise of the new right. What we see happening in the late 70s is something historians sometimes call the Fourth Great Awakening. It was a grassroots mobilization of evangelical Christians who felt deeply alienated by the liberal social policies of the previous decade. We see the rapid growth of evangelical church membership, which absolutely skyrocketed, while mainline Protestant numbers dropped. We see the rise of those massive televangelist media empires reaching homes every single week. And most importantly for our political landscape, we see the mobilization around family values as a core central political issue that candidates literally had to actively answer to if they wanted to win. But here's the thing. The new right wasn't just about social issues. It was deeply rooted in economics too. As inflation pushed property values and taxes through the roof in places like California, an anti-tax crusade took hold among suburban homeowners. In 1978, a huge game changer called Proposition 13 passed, drastically rolling back property taxes and capping future increases. This campaign capitalized directly on suburban inflation fears and cemented low taxes as a defining non-negotiable pillar of the modern conservative movement. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to really ponder. How did the tensions of the 1970s between liberal social movements and conservative grassroots organizing continue to define American politics today? When you look at today's deeply divided political map, the debates we have over the economy, over gender, over trust in government, you are looking directly at roots planted during the chaos, crises, and realignments of the 1970s. The search for order didn't just magically end in 1980. In a lot of ways, it just set the stage for the world we navigate right now. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.